Welcome back to the Comparesoft podcast. Today's guest is Allan Fairhurst, a regional field service manager with extensive hands-on experience across fibre to the premises delivery, building insurance, utilities and regional operations. Allan progressed from plant operator, where he worked on projects that included HS2 and the Commonwealth Games, into senior field service leadership. Before stepping into telecoms and utilities, Allan also served in the British Army as a logistics supply specialist. In this episode, we'll be talking about safety culture, coordinating complex FTTP delivery, managing regional performance, using technology to improve operations, and the lessons Allan has picked up in moving from the tools into leadership. Allan, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. We like to start these chats by getting a sense of your professional journey. So in your case, you've gone from a plant operator, supervisor and technician to eventually a regional field service manager. How have those early practical hands-on roles helped you succeed in more management leadership roles?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you very much for having me, Ryan. And I think how it's helped me is having a sense of the do. So going through the motions of first starting off, say, as a plant operator. So even before that, I started off on construction sites doing anything I could. I was a service leaver. I came out and thought I'm a bit behind some of the other people in the industry. So I took my hand at anything I could get hold of. So steel fixing, shuttering, bricklaying, mixing, any kind of labouring job I could get, and then eventually got into plant operations. So a bit more of an oversight, I think, into how sites work. I was moving up, but then I was also getting involved in lots and lots of different projects. So anyhow, I'd get my hands on, if it was archaeological works, large infrastructure projects, small track work, mud shifting, you name it, I wanted to do it. And it was when I was contracting for another company, and they said, well, we really like the way that you work. Would you like to come and work for us full time? And I said, well, I'd love to, but again, think about career progressions. I think I'm ready for a supervisor role. So they gave me the supervisor role, which is brilliant. A lot of hands-on experience with then managing teams, managing sites, site setups, risk assessments, method statements, you name it. Which then again sort of brought me into, I had an experience where, we hit an electrical cable and a rather large voltage cable on the highways. And I sort of thought, wow, there's another area I'm not too familiar with now, which is utilities. So I got a job as a utility services technician for local authorities, where I was using ground penetrating radars, EM locators, to go out on SED projects. So combined with my civils background, I was now going out, and what people said was, a bit of X-ray vision, looking under the ground. What is there before we go and open up permits and just dig holes? What are we up against? So it was primarily things that if there was ever a substation, a bridge, something that was a bit out of the norm that may have additional utilities or shallow utilities, I would go out first, survey it all, and then report back on, what you need to be careful out for. Maybe you need to contact some utility companies prior to, if you're working near a rail bridge. Or Caden, for example, if you're working near sort of larger pipelines, which are all flagged up with those nice red and white poles. But then also interpreting drawings. So again, working near intermediate high pressures, I need to get Caden to help. So formed a good working relationship with some of the utility companies, where they would have to come out first and things permissions, survey the locations. But then stepping into management was a case of, I was working for the local authorities at the time, and I saw that, I knew with fibre was booming. They were digging up the streets everywhere, but they were also hitting cables left, right and centre. So I had a good knowledge of that. I knew there was a company that was coming up to my area in Cheshire East. I sort of knew the background of some of the issues they were having, and thought there was an opportunity there for me to get in and help them with, what I knew they were kind of struggling with behind the scenes. And so that's kind of the origin story in a nutshell. I walked into the office, and I heard of what they were doing, what they wanted to do. Sounded all a bit like a fairy tale at first. So I walked in there, told them what I do, what my background is. They said, we've got no idea what you just said, but it sounds like you know what you're talking about. And I got a job. And pretty similar to my coming up, I first started off doing a lot of that, a lot of the utility surveying, where people should dig, where they shouldn't, minimizing downtime, increasing safety, productivity going up. It was, well, he knows what he's doing. I then went into, build assurance, where it was essentially, here's a couple of contractors. So then it was all manner of digging, fibre works, permitting, managing civils crews and fibre crews. And then once the build was sort of coming to an end again, it was onto service delivery then, which is where I got I was looking after the Northwest and Midlands for the field service, so eventually delivering it. But not to say that the jobs beforehand didn't lead up into it, because we were still, finishing bits of build where we could find it. We were still, because we were dealing with traditional digs as well. So there was a lot of digging around utilities, but then again on private properties, if you're going to dig through somebody's driveway, somebody's garden, you're still going to have to make sure that you choose the right routes that is safe and you're not going to be knocking in. So that's me in a nutshell, really, right?
Excellent. Did you have how was the jump from no team to then managing these crews, that you're taking a part of your FTTP delivery?
So the jump was, I was hungry for it, so that helped. Again, my background in the service in the military was, I was quite used to leading teams, but then it was also assisted, I think, from a background of coming up through that. I'd worked with the fibre teams, I'd worked with the civils teams, I knew what they needed, what they wanted. I'd done a lot of it myself. So when it came to sort of bringing them all together, it felt like a natural sort of progression, a natural transition. Because it wasn't strange to me. The only thing that maybe was strange was then going into the direct reporting lines, dealing with the welfares and that side of things, of career progressions. That was a little bit new, but again, not a challenge that I didn't seek.
Excellent. Yeah, it sounds like you just take the opportunity, opportunity knocks and you're there.
100%. It always does. You don't know where it's going to come from. So always, if it was something that I hadn't done before, I want to learn it. And it was a case like that. Here's something I've not really done before, but I've done a lot around it. I can learn from this. I want it.
And we'll come to this later on, but the advice there, it sounds like you're going to have for aspiring managers and people who've come from a field service engineering background, possibly still there, you're going to have a lot of advice and how they build that up and how they adapt in different scenarios and different roles. You've touched on it already. Your early career was with the British Army as a
Yes.
logistics supply specialist.
Yes.
This really interests me. So what were your day-to-day responsibilities there? What did that entail? What lessons did you take from military logistics that kind of shaped the way you lead different teams today?
So a couple of things in there. So day to day, it can vary a lot. I would say that, I did have the opportunity to go abroad and all around the world. So the wider understanding with logistics was, you start off doing your receipting and your issuing, so into a warehouse, out of a warehouse, but then you progress into sort of like provisioning levels, accounting. Again, this is all the equipment and things that have a monetary value attached to it that, ultimately comes from the taxpayer, so it must be accounted for, it must be managed. So it would depend, it would vary. One of my roles was in what we call the PCNA, provision control and accounting. So that was very much the other dependencies. So we would have many units, infantry units, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, engineering units, and they would have a whole host of equipment that they need and want. So it was our job to, set provisioning levels. How much of something are they allowed? If there was 100 people, do they really need 5,000 screwdrivers, for example? So we would set those provisioning levels low so that they wouldn't, be overstocked. We could control the inventorying that way, but then also dealing with immediate demands. There was sometimes cases where somebody needs something right now. That has to go through authority, and again, it has to be moved and tracked and accounted for. So a lot of that, but then also a lot of kind of setting up remote logistics, what we call like divlog RVs, where you can go to any location and basically set up a mini warehouse where people bring stores in, they take stores out. So you set it all up, you collapse it, you move on. So it's very, very varying. And again, still, there was a lot of green skills, what we call green skills mixed in there. So ensuring that, if you are setting up remotely, you're camouflaged, you are concealed, you've got a minimal footprint, taking into consideration locals, taking into consideration security, a whole host of things, but then also your own logistics, your own water, your own food. So yeah, I'm not, we could do another segment on it, but we need a few hours. There's a lot involved. Essentially, it's ensuring that people have got what they need. Particularly those frontline units. They can't perform if they've not got what they need. So it was people like myself's job to ensure they've got what they need when they
And
need it.
you briefly touched there about provisions. It was obviously understocking and overstocking is quite an issue when it comes to spare parts availability. Was that one of the biggest issues that you faced, and how did you really go about it? Reducing that sort of challenge.
So yes, so again, so you think you were operating all over the world. So one of my roles was to interrogate, the due ins, things that are due into units that they've ordered. But if you think about it, a lot of this stuff is coming from air, it's coming from land, rail, sea, and this could be all over the world. So there may be a case where somebody's ordered something and it's not arrived in time, but they've ordered it via the train. Then they've ordered it and got it on a plane, so they've already got it. So then we have to go into and find out where in the world that equipment is, because it's still got value attached to it, and somebody will still need it. So it was a lot of juggling, I would say. As long as they've got what they need, but then again, if there are double orders, if there is equipment out there due into people and they haven't since received it, find it, send it back to where it needs to go so it's available for the next person.
It sounds like a lot of layers, involved in that.
A lot of layers, yeah. I think that's why, there's 24 hours in a day, or there just should be 25.
So another part of your experience which really interests me is the integral part you've played in large infrastructure operations. So as a plant operator, you supported major projects like HS2 and the Commonwealth Games. What did that teach you about the pace, coordination, and the planning of working on projects of that scale?
Yeah, so I almost wish I went from the smaller projects to the larger ones, because I was spoiled with the larger ones. So the pace of the larger projects is a lot slower. And I think, primarily it's to do with budgets. You have a huge budget, with these big projects like HS2. You have multiple health and safety managers, advisors, framework managers, etc., and designers who no one's really rushed. They're able to take a lot of time to plan these things. So the pace on site was very coordinated. There was a set scheme of what had to be done, and it wasn't a case of just get it done. It was a case of, no, we're going to take our time for A, B, C, D, E, and it's going to get us to an F at the end of the day. So pace setting was a big one that it allowed you a lot of time to think. And again, projects like the HS2, where I was on the initial pre-setup, so anything from demolishing SAS tanks on old sort of water sites, up to the removal of graveyards on Curzon Street, to digging up the old 200-year train station to have a look at the old architecture and how they built things 200 years ago. So there was a lot of moving parts, but it wasn't all rushed into one. And similarly, like the Commonwealth Games, pre-enablements for that is we want to build a swimming pool. Okay, well, again, we have lots of sewage, utilities, things to think about. So, moving those out of the way well before the Commonwealth Games was, going to be trialed. So taking essentially an empty field into an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and all-encompassing things around that. So PIE's very well thought out. They thought very far into the future. And the planning of it as well was next level. So me as a plant operator, coming from sort of just working on the highways, you have a supervisor that tells you to dig there, but you walk onto a larger project like the HS2, like the Commonwealth Games at the time. You sit down with the project manager, everyone at every level, and you go through the designs. You go through I'm not just talking like utility plans. I'm talking like real CAD drawings of where everything's going to go, where it's going to end up, phases 1, 2, and 3, what's it going to look like now, tomorrow, next week, and the month after.
And that's everyone involved on the project.
Yeah, I walked on as a plant operator onto the Commonwealth Games one, and they showed me that I'm used to looking at utility drawings, and they showed me a drawing, and I thought, I do not understand this. So I told the project manager, I don't know. I understand, I can find a utility, but this is a bit beyond me. He wasn't frustrated. He wasn't, disappointed. He just, great, let me show you. And we spent a good solid hour just going over the drawing, explaining to me, what was what. And that kind of showed me that and it's kind of stuck with me. You go faster by going slower. He took the time to invest a bit of time into me to explain what the designs were, what they mean, to give me the understanding. So then when I do go out onto site, I've got that wider picture and wider understanding, and I'm probably not going to be as nervous or
And
flat.
that's gone a long way for you help to understand the project as a whole as well.
Yeah, massively. Another saying from the military, an informed soldier is a happy soldier. So I've always taken that with me. I've always found that when I'm on site and somebody explains to me the project, what is our ultimate goal? What is the mission? And the step by steps, you doing this is going to help us achieve X and help us to achieve Y and get to our goal. That really helps, I think, to understand the wider sort of mission and what you're doing. Instead of just living day by day digging holes.
Yeah. Wow, amazing. And then fast forward to your time at Zoom. So you coordinated the fibre to the premises delivery, from design and planning to engineering and permitting. Where did you see the gaps between what was planned on paper to what was actually delivered on the ground? Was it similar to your experience on working on HS2 and the Commonwealth Games? Was it that detailed planning?
No, it was different. Again, I think I'll attribute that to the budgets. I feel, and with me, I'll be a bit biased towards utilities and utility locating. I believe at the time 9 out of 10 problems could be solved with a cat and Jenny, and I think that's where I saw the biggest difference between what was delivered and what was on the planning, was because planning, they'll take like an old OS map, an old utility map, and say, I want to put a cabinet here, for example. And then, you put your permits through, but you get there, then, there's a gas pipe, there's an electric cable or something. I can't put it there. And so, this is a permanent fixed asset. So they'd have to move it. So that's where I initially started, was, again, mapping out these places. So I would go to someone and say, right, I want to put an active cabinet here because it's right next to the exchange. It's great, minimal distance for us to go. But then I'd go out there and say, no, you have to survey, on site, be there in person. And there was one I remember, which was kind of proved the point for myself, where I went out, the location looked great, but where they wanted to put it was a small plaque in like this lovely little wooden dairy. It's an ancient burial ground. So I said, right, well, we're not going to get permission to put it there. So I started going around and surveying alternate locations away from utilities, no gas, waters, but then also not too far away from a DNO supply, so you could get electricity to the cabinet. So then we started, putting these cabinets in right first time. But, there were some you could see where it's supposed to be here, but then due to issues on the day, it got moved somewhere else. I think that was the biggest thing I noticed from delivery. That on those larger infrastructure projects, you would take a very long time doing a lot of your pre-site surveys, a lot of your trial holes, investigations. Whereas in the fibre world, everything's very quick. It has to get in the ground yesterday, and maybe some steps weren't followed. But that's probably the biggest thing I noticed, the difference between what was delivered and what was planned.
And just as that example you gave us there, finding alternative routes around the graveyard, what sort of delay did that put onto that particular section of the project?
Well, here's the thing. Because I was able to go out and pre-site survey it, there was no delay. Because it was a case of, we want to do this in a couple of weeks. Can you go and check? So I would go and check, and I would say that's not good enough, but at the same time, I provide an alternative location, which will still provide them access to the PIA. It would still provide them access to a DNO. There would be no delay in that. However, to have not done that pre-site survey, it would have been a wasted permit. It would have been wasted, 3 to 6 days of, planning time for a certain civils gang. So really, we saved money, we saved time by doing these sort of pre-site surveys and investigations. But there were other times where I would be called out to site and, a live permit's in place. Look, there's a utility here. What do we do? We have to close the permit, leave site. We have to reassess and find somewhere else for it to go.
Additional plan is not only saving time, it's saving costs, as you just mentioned.
Absolutely.
It's so essential.
Big cost savings. You think you're paying, your civils crews made up of a ganger, a couple of other ground workers, your supervisor, the equipment, the fuel, the permits, everything that you would have had in place to get there. Then all of a sudden, those 3 days that were planned for that work, it's cost saving on that, but then also the planning. There's somebody who's planned that work and coordinated it into a scheme of build. So now they're going to have to move them onto another project to keep them busy.
It's amazing. So when overseeing this FTTP delivery, obviously there's a focus on accuracy, efficiency, and at the end of the day, the customer satisfaction. So in your experience, do you believe the end customers ultimately desire speed, communication, or installation quality? If you could number those in order, what would be at the top?
Okay, so yeah, that is a hard one because
Mm.
they would like all three. But from my experience, I think the first one is quality. They prefer the quality. They want the quality. And you go into something, you're drilling holes, you're putting things on the wall, running cables around the place. I attribute that just to, I would have or deal with probably more issues and complaints surrounding, I don't want this here. This is an eyesore. You've drilled the wrong hole. You've hit the pipes. You've clipped the cables. Than people with speed issues, because I think speed's going to be second. But a lot of that was generally around. I think if you're advertising it like a 1 gigabit package, they want to see a gigabit. But then they're testing it on their phone a couple of rooms away, and then it's just an explanation or a bit of education for them about the limitations of Wi-Fi. User direct connections. So I think definitely quality. Definitely then comes the speed and the communication. They're all very important, but I put them in that order, just purely on how I had to deal with them. The communication has to be on point, particularly when you deal with things like failed activations, what we call when you can't install for a reason. They want to know when you're coming back, when you're going to fix it, when am I getting my broadband.
And I suppose within that communication, you've got layers like, educating them how to do this, how to reset this, and then managing their expectations. Like you said, you're not going to get a 1 gigabyte signal and speed here, you're going to get it there. And if you're closer to this.
That is having the experience and the knowledge, or rather in your teams to explain that to them. Well, why? Tell me why. And then, you go through things where you've got a very large house, you've got, we were like Wi-Fi's a little bit like water, it's not going to go straight through a wall. It's going to take the path of least resistance. So when they start, understanding things like that, great. But I think, because we did sort of run very quickly in this country from, like I remember when it was the old dial-up versus now you can get a gigabit of broadband. I would never use a gigabit, but again, people want to see it. So yeah, that would be my order. They all play different parts, crucially. But I think based on the most complaints probably you get, it's going to be the quality of the installation.
And Allan, I'm really intrigued to understand more about how you measured and tracked operations throughout your different roles. So if we start as regional field service manager, you produced high-level KPI reporting across geographic regions. Which KPIs matter most when you're trying to build a consistently high-performing team and operation?
Okay, so high-performing team, very different to, I think, what the C-suite want to hear. But, measuring performance for me, there were two KPIs I always talked about. And as long as they were consistently low or high, whichever way you're measuring them, then I was happy. And it was the completed successful jobs per day and also the what we call the failed activations. How many failed activations have you managed to turn around and fix? So what that told me when I was reporting is that, say we have a KPI of 4 installations per engineer per day, and that keeps us, making money and profitable. But what if 3 of those jobs fail? So I would take it that, we would do it again, pre-site surveying and getting eyes on as many jobs as we can to make sure that, they're going to succeed and pass in the first place, but then also replace those jobs. So having the engineers sufficiently trained and trusted to make a decision whether or not that job can go in. And so they've got enough time to find a replacement so they can still achieve getting their 4 installations per day. So that was a very key one. It wasn't just jobs completed per day because they may have visited 8, but only 4 may have been successful. So successful jobs completed per day was 1. And then again, the failed activations, because there's still customers who will place an order. They want their broadband. So at the end of the day, you may have achieved those 4 installations successful at the end of the day, but then you're also left with these ones that were unsuccessful. So as long as you're hitting your 4 a day, that's brilliant. And then the ones that you're fixing, adding on top of that, or they're coming in as replacements for ones that, again, a phone call, this job's not going to happen. So for me, I think a successful team, that's what I looked for. I looked for the completion rates of successful jobs on the day. and then the turnaround and successful installation of the failed ones. Also, the time scale of them as well. If it was outside of the 30 days for turnaround, that doesn't look good. You're in trouble. But if you're fixing them in the next week, fantastic.
This is very end user focused, very delivery focused, those KPIs.
Yes, yeah. Again, once they're on the books and they are signed up receiving their services, again, that's what we're going to with the shareholders. We've got X amount of customers online paying. If those installations have failed, we've placed 1,000 orders, but we've only got 750 across the line. That's not good. That's not a paying customer. So that deficit of the 250 who are still waiting, we have to work on those. They're still going to be turned into live paying customers.
And there's two other areas that really interest me on your experience. So the first is your strong focus on ensuring compliance and safety. I'm really intrigued, what does a real safety culture look like beyond the paperwork, beyond the mandatory training?
Okay, so culture is a huge one. What culture looks like, a good safety culture beyond the mandatory. So it would be, for me, I always said to my team, we fail forwards. If you make a mistake, if you have an accident, it's, there's not going to be a repercussion, unless, it's deliberate and something deserves it and warrants it. But if you have an accident, it's a chance to learn. It's an opportunity to learn. So I want you to tell me, what did you do wrong? What are you going to do better next time? And there's a couple of things, it forces a bit of relief into the team. But also it also forces them to look at problems and issues, health and safety things in a different way. I think so. So for me, what it looked like is when good practices are shared and praised, when people are kind of shouting about it, well, then also how people are dealing with things when you're not there and you can't see it. So somebody does come up against, I'm trying to think of an example here. So putting up an overhead cable, they know they can get the cable from the pole across the carriageway to the house, but it's not going to be within the right tolerances. And they know it's going to look bad on their KPI because it's going to be a failed installation. But for them to have the confidence to turn around and say, I can't do this job because it won't be safe for me to do it, to me, that's what the culture looks like. And for them to confidently come to me and say, very, very sorry, it's not going to happen. But I'd always say, tell me how it could happen and, always come up with a solution. So that's what we would always have, that, that an engineer would fail it, but then we get like half a page of notes on why it's failed, what they've seen and what would need to happen for, this to get resolved, which, again, would minimize downtime. Again, we're, instead of doing 3-4 different visits, we're doing one visit, they've identified it, the second visit to fix it, and the third one's going in. So to me, that's what it looks like. It's people doing the right thing when you're not there and having the confidence, even when it impacts them financially, it impacts their KPIs, for them to have the confidence and, ability to stand up and say, yeah, I can't do this or I won't do this, but this is how we could do it. I'm not just blowing it off.
Yeah. Yeah. The second one that really intrigued me just on that was your leading the root cause analysis and investigations. That really stood out to me. So how do you make sure you identify the real issue rather than just the obvious one?
Good question. So the 5 whys, I always think why in my head. You ask why enough times, you'll get to the root cause. I cut my leg. Why did you do that? Oh, because, well, you'll get to it eventually. But for me, it's, you get your immediate, which is the action. Let's say the one I did to deal with a still saw cut to the leg. So your immediate is the action of the still saw cutting the leg. Okay, so why did he do that? And then it turned out, well, had his head down, somebody entered the work area and they brushed past him and he got a bit shocked and he stood up. Okay, well, why did they enter the work area? Why did they brush past him? Then we went into training and it turned out that, may not have had their cut off saw training. So again, you ask why. There are multiple layers. We can't say again, the immediate will be that action. The underlying is something that may have caused it, but then the root cause, there's also something called the fishbone diagram. So again, I will take field service because that's what I've been working in. If you think all of the contributing factors that could lead up to it, it will be the person, it will be the training, it will be the equipment, it will be the ground type, was it raining, etc. And you put all these in a nice little diagram and you investigate them all. Was it raining? What was visibility like? What was the equipment they were wearing? Was he impaired with his sight? Obviously he was wearing, headphones, so he couldn't hear anything anyway. The people, why was that person walking into the site behind him? And then, all of these things you sort of assign, what is the more likely cause? And again, it might not just be one singular thing. It may be a couple of things that may be the root cause. In this instance, mainly lack of training, and somebody entering a work sites when they shouldn't. So how do you deal with that? Training. So, root cause would be training. So again, just asking why, getting to those levels, what are all the contributing factors that could have contributed to it, investigate them thoroughly, get to the end of it, identify the team needs more training, get them the training, but then also including things like lessons learned. So in this instance, somebody also in walking into a small works area, let's get that into the training, being mindful that if somebody's working down, they've got the headphones on, they can't hear anything anyway. Take 5, wait for them to finish, then approach them.
So it sounds like you're also a private detective on top of regional field service management.
It is interesting, yeah, because it's a bit, again, something that's new, different. Again, things like incident service delivery, it's all different, and I like that. I like that very much. You get a lot of variety in your work. So I'm not saying I like people having accidents, but it's the when there's something new, something to investigate. Yeah, it's we want to learn and understand why something happened. And for me, that's always been it. Again, coming back to where I said, people failing jobs, I want to know why. Because when I can understand why that's happened, we can put things in place to mitigate and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. Our role at Comparesoft, I'm always looking at different tools, different technologies, how they're implemented, what output they're giving. You supported the rollout of new technologies as Zoom, to streamline your delivery. I'm really curious what types of tools, even the most simplest ones, what made the biggest difference to performance or cost?
I'd say initially, one for me, and I'm going to be biased, utility locating. So I came from using advanced utility locating equipment, and these things are very, very expensive. So I kind of tried to push it in at first, but then, trying to measure what is the cost saving implications of spending more on this equipment. We sort of settled on, I ran a trial where we brought in a different locator than what they were using. It was cheaper, but did the exact same job and a bit more as well. So we were having 6 strikes per kilometre. So every time you have a strike, on a utility, you've got to stop work, you've got to investigate, you've got to call out the utility company that's customers effective and costs and everything. So I said, I can train people, I can teach them how to use this equipment, and it's going to save you money and it's going to help you make more money. So we ran the trial. I did it in 4 different regions. They all got I gave them all training on, EM locating, a bit of PAS 128, understanding surveying the ground. And we reduced that strike ratio from a 6 per kilometre to a 0.4. And that 0.4 represented just 1 strike, which they marked up. They knew it was but they hit it anyway. So I don't count it, but I had to count it for the trial. So what we proved there is they were able to do more meterage because they weren't stopping by having these 6 strikes per kilometre. So you were getting increased productivity, you were saving money on the equipment, and really the only extra thing you had to invest in it was me. You just had to employ myself to come and give a bit of this training and education to the teams. But as soon as they saw it, they bought into it. So you don't even have, I taught them you didn't even have to use all the time the locator itself. It's having that condor moment at the beginning. Don't jump straight in there. There was one street where they wanted to put a top cutter, a trencher down, which just churns the ground up to a certain depth. And I found all the utilities except for the gas because it was made of plastic. But then I noticed this on the ground. I found everything else. Then there was a suspicious scar running up the carriageway with dots running up the carriageway, which is suspiciously in line with the gas risers of each property. So I found everything else. That has to be the gas. So I labelled it up as gas. And I said, you're not really going to know how deep it is because it's plastic. It used to be metallic. Likely they've replaced it all and likely they've molded it. So, they've used a mold to send it up to the property. So you're not going to know what depth it's at. So I suggest when you get to these sections, lift your top cutter and go over it and carry on that way. And then we'll just, dig by hand around those bits. I think they sent the trencher down right where I'd marked there should be a plastic gas pipe, and it was 300 mil, went straight through it. And the
Mm.
the health and safety team loved it because it did prove that even though we didn't use I didn't use an EM locator, didn't use a GPR, I could still find the utility that it's exactly where he said it was going to be.
Yeah.
And I said, how did you do that? I just looked. That's all I did, just looked. So I would say the cat and jelly and the training on the EM locating had the biggest impact, definitely in terms of, health and safety and productivity for the teams.
Yeah, incredible. And so you've also overseen logistics, materials handling, obviously managing teams. So that comes down to a lot of project management and materials management.
Yes.
Sorry, Alan, what tools have you seen that are most successful in those areas? We've had a lot of people on saying they've had a mix of spreadsheet softwares, they find a nice balance between the two or something completely different.
So it was spreadsheets for us. Again, there wasn't any sort of, there was what you could call, a WMS, warehouse management system. But it was mostly done with Excel because, if we would get our designs, and each design, when you get to the high level, will tell you, where the nodes are going, where the fibers are going from your 144s down to your 12Fs, your ultra lightweight overheads, aerial nodes, underground nodes. And you could extract from that the bill of materials that you would need to build that. So the very first thing was making sure that was accurate. So we would get the design, the low level, survey it. No, actually, we need to put this amount of fibers in. We need to put a bit of track and trenching here or this there. So in the end, we would get an accurate representation of all the materials, the amount of meterage, trenching, meterage underground, overhead, different types of fibers we're going to need. So you get an overall accurate representation of what it's going to cost you. And then it was just a case of, fortunately, we had a depot, we had a good depot team. We did have project managers who would take care of a lot of those things. My role was primarily ensuring that those designs were as accurate as they could be so that they could order the materials. So, at the end of the day, you're not left over with too much and you're definitely not short by what you need to deliver. But doing that again ahead of time. And I know coming back to doing the surveying originally, making sure they are all properly surveyed so you're not coming into any unknowns, where, we've got 600 meters of PIA here that we've got to turn into trenching, huge cost implications.
Yeah. So, Alan, what we like to do in these last few questions is get you sharing your insight and your advice, during your career. One of the biggest insights you will have is because of your progress from that technician level work to leadership roles. So for any engineers wanting to move into a leadership role, what skills or behaviors do you believe are essential for the biggest difference?
Okay, so for me, and I read this somewhere the other day, and they said that, a lot of jobs, 80% of the skills could be taught. And I definitely felt that when I was recruiting. I would say I'm not looking for the 80%, I'm looking for the 20% I can't teach, which is your behavior, your work ethic, your morality, your integrity. Those are the things I want because we can send you on courses, we can get you qualifications, we can get you trained up. But for me, it was, I always said to everyone that I ever really met that, one thing you'll always find with myself is integrity. I'll tell you the truth. Can't lie myself. And even, if it's going to get you in trouble, tell the truth. And I think that's where, the failing forward came forward. And that's why we had to have such a, a high performing team, was that we didn't waste time on pointing the finger at people. It's just, we know what the problem is. We know where we need to get to for a solution. So let's get there as quickly as possible and learn along the way. So I would say, if you're looking to take that jump, it's, don't waste the time with pointing fingers. Be that person who's going to stand up in the room and say, I know what the solution is. I know what needs to be done, and go and do it. Because, there's a lot of people who will information manage, and they can information manage, but, we need a lot of doers. And I found that's probably where I had the most success, was because I would just always get up and do it. And along with that, it wasn't a case of, me thinking nobody else is going to do it. I want that experience. I want to know how this is going to be fixed. I can do it myself, so it will progress me. And next time I come up against something like this, I'm not practicing until I get it right. I'm going to practice until I can't get it wrong. I want to keep doing it. So I would say anybody who's looking to make the jump, do the do. Don't wait for somebody else either, and do it yourself. Be humble with it as well. And look around you. Again, there's a big difference. I think anyway, there's a big difference between management and leadership. With management, you get a title as a manager, but with being a leader, anybody can do that. Anybody can be a leader, standing up, doing the right thing, staying a bit late, coming in early, just coming in on time and doing your job how it's supposed to be done. The management side, sure, those boxes are ticked and the forms are filled in. So get the balance right, know when to apply both of those things, but do the do.
Excellent. Allan, thank you so much for sharing your experience today. There's been some really powerful takeaways there around safety culture, leadership progression, and particularly what it takes to run field operations at scale. You've seen it from the beginning to the end. It's incredible. If you're listening and you manage a team of engineers or you aspire to take a leadership role, I hope you've taken something practical away from this conversation today. So thank you for listening. Allan, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Awesome. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you. Bye.